ladies and gentlemen, I would like us to be very interactive, to engage, give a question, start writing them down so that you don't give us a speech before your question. Just shoot straight to the question, and then it's for them to respond to the question. So I believe we should be ready. Your opportunity to speak start now. Rendani.
All right, thank you very much to our moderator. Yeah, I think I'm quite comfortable in terms of keeping time, even more that we have an extra 2 minutes. All right, so I think it would have been great if the first presenter was here, especially even more that part of the data I'm using is from SESTI, and she's part of the team gathering that data. So I was looking forward to hearing part of that presentation, and I think there was a flow in between the two. So the focus of the presentation today is understanding the declining business sector and the investment in South Africa, and I'll bring about some of my thoughts on the implications for industrial policy. In terms of the introduction, so from literature, we know that the business sector and the investment increases productivity and export payoffs. We also know that there is a significant, a positive relationship between the business sector and the investment, and also the productivity. We also know that even though they are always scholars in different sides of the fence, I just read one this morning as well, trying to encourage otherwise, but I mean, that's part of what the scholars do, that public sector and the investment encourages the business sector and the investment. So there is that supposedly alignment in between the public sector investment on R&D and how that encourages the private sector as well. And then what literature also says is that compared to equipment and structures investment, the business sector investment in R&D offers 7 times the rate of return at the national level. So investment in R&D is key, and that's why there is a lot of conversation globally around increasing the investment in R&D. In terms of the South African perspective, we have observed that there's a decline in the investment. President Mbeki mentioned that it looks like it's quite abnormal, the level of liquidity that some of the corporates have, but other scholars have argued against some of those aspects in terms of there isn't really causalities around some of those arguments. So what I'm trying to do with this research as a start is to understand this declining business R&D investment in South Africa. And I make use of R&D investment data from SESTI. SESTI is within the HSRC. And I also decided to pull in some data from WIPO on domestic patents granted when I'm trying to see how some of these things could potentially link up. So I don't build any statistical work as yet, but it's just to bring in the data, bring some visuals, and try to see how all of these things could potentially look like. In terms of some of the results, so South Africa has a target of achieving 1.5% of R&D investment as a percentage of GDP, and it's good that we have a representative from the DSI here. And as you can see, we've been hovering below 0.7 in the last 10 years, and we actually seem to be struggling to get that investment up to where we want. We're actually at about half of our target, and we have actually seen a decline since 2017. So we'll see if the next set of data continues in that trend or not. What we also then see R&D investment in terms of source. So our R&D investment comes from the government, from the business, and from foreign investment. What we see is that government over the years seems to be increasing its R&D investment. I think it's now over 50%, while there has been a decline on the business side. On the foreign side, seems to pretty much be the same, even though in 2019 we see a slight increase. What we also see in terms of R&D investment by research type, so we've got basic, applied, and experimental research. South Africa seems to have shifted away from experimental research. This is where you commercialize and do the development work to drive the technologies to market. We seem to have made a shift from experimental research towards more research. This data comes from countries like and also China. But what we see is that South Africa seems to be applying a lot of its emphasis around applied research. And I'm going to come into some of these things later on, what I consider to be some of the emerging things. But we currently suboptimally invest in our R&D when you look at the research types. Going further into this, when you look at state R&D investment, very little of it flows to the business sector. It largely goes to higher education and the Science Council. So public R&D investment seems to stay largely in the public sphere. We see very little interface between what the government is putting in and that actually going into the private sector space. The reverse is equally true. Business sector invests R&D in itself, doesn't seem to be flowing those funds outside of itself. And I'll come back to that as well as one of the emerging issue. On the foreign side, we seem to have seen a shift away from foreign investment going on R&D, going to the business sector. It's moving away into higher education sector. So it's quite an interesting shift from that perspective. Then when we look at the other graph on the research type was on the overall R&D investment in South Africa. What we do see from the business side, the business itself has made the shift away from experimental and more into applied research. And what this means is that the business is investing in solving the problems of today and then being able to make a return as quickly as possible. Very little focus on the experimental work, which should be driving the long-term development in technology. Of course, it's risky, but we seem to see a shift from that perspective. And then lastly, in terms of some data sets, I was quite alarmed the first time, and I'm bringing this up because there's some element of the R&D that is flowing from the foreign side. When we look at domestic granted patents, almost over 90% of these are granted to non-residents. And part of the question on this is, are these patents actually being utilized in the country, or are they just being used as a hindrance for local innovation? I think there's an opportunity there to reflect from both innovation and also industrial. And this trend seems to be very much consistent over the years. So perhaps our moderator, when you make some of his reflection, you will chat to us about it. But in terms of some emerging themes from this data set is that we suboptimally overinvest on applied research. So there's nothing wrong in investing in applied research, but when you are consistently investing in applied research, it means you're not investing in the experimental part, which is quite key from a commercialization of technology perspective. Same with and this seems to be driven from the business sector side. In fact, there's a scholar from Rhodes who has engaged on this data quite well in terms of actually the shift is not that there isn't money. The shift is that the business sector has moved away from experimental research, and that has impacted innovation performance, even though his definition of innovation performance was quite narrow. So it will be interesting to see when we broaden that, because he only looked at patents and the publication. So it will be interesting to see if the definition is broadened, if we still see a decline on the performance by this shift that we observe. And this underinvestment in experimental research could explain the persistent innovation chasm or the technology value of death that exists, or that is a character of our national system of innovation. And as I've already indicated, the flow, when the states invest, you don't seem to be seeing that flowing into the private sector and vice versa. And we have also observed the shift on the higher education side on that. And as I've indicated, on the domestic patterns, there seems to be this dominance by non-resident. There's nothing wrong with that, but this disproportion seems to implicate and impede us in some of the innovation work that we're trying to do. So some of my tentative, and I call them tentative because this is work I am engaging on, and we'll see how far I move with it. There seems to be some maybe misalignment between the state and the business sector in terms of R&D objectives. We don't seem to be finding a coalition between the two. And as I've indicated, the business has reduced and redirected its investment towards applied, which is a short term. And there's nothing wrong with business doing that, but I think broadly, you want to balance your investment so that you've got a long-term view. And that's where your basic and experimental research comes in. So I think from an industrial policy perspective, especially considering aspects of localization, of which I think the DTIC has done well in terms of establishing the manufacturing hubs of different international entities, I think there's a need to include part of that element as localizing some of the R&D, at least from a basic and experimental research perspective, and not only to put a manufacturing side. Part of the research that others have done show that over the years, the multinationals have shifted their R&D away from us, which means we are not able to actually learn by doing in a manner that allow us to also sophisticate our own economy. I think this links up with the conversation on skills yesterday, that if we're not involved in some of these things, then we are quite limited. And I think from a state point of view, I think the state, in part of fostering this interaction between the state and the business sector, I think the state must increase its allocation of R&D that also goes into the private sector. And perhaps through some element of contract R&D, I think this is part of the work that Mazzucato has argued, that you can have instances where the state is not merely a facilitator of markets, but a shaper and a creator. But part of that shaping and creation of markets, it means it must allocate funds that are also on the R&D sense, but the objectives are that of the state, where the private sector is merely executing what the state has put in place. And I think that could align well with some of the work that the DSI has on the decadal plan around the moonshoots or the grand challenges, where the state can use that to contract the private sector from that perspective. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. You've really used about 13 minutes of the time allocated to you. So thank you so much. While we are going to the second presenter, the next speaker is Dr. Freeman Mateko. He's also postdoc research fellow at UJ, University of Johannesburg, and he's also research chair for industrial development. I think the time is yours.
All right. Thank you. I haven't changed my name, as you have heard, so you can see it there. So I'm going to look at opportunities for Southern Africa in emerging technologies, how the Global South should adapt to and take advantage of emerging technologies. So this is the format I'm going to use in this presentation. So you find that we don't have a universal definition of what emerging technologies are, and these definitions, they can vary depending on the context. But you find that there are a number of things that fall under emerging technologies, and these include artificial intelligence, 3D printing, biotech, water purification technologies, software applications, as well as hydrogen technologies. You are going to discover that China has used some of these emerging technologies for effective poverty reduction over the previous years. And research shows that it managed to use technology to reduce poverty and helped 770 million people for the previous years. So we are going to find that also that emerging technologies, they present opportunities or prospects for the development of new markets, for the provision of new services, job creation, and they can also be used to deal with some of the environmental challenges which we face here in Africa. Now, what is the main thing I looking at this research? So the first thing I want to look the opportunities which can be explored by the Southern Africa. And all right, then secondly, want to look at the challenges which are faced by Southern Africa and as far as the full adoption of emerging technologies is concerned, and then thirdly, to suggest some policy recommendations. So in terms of the literature review, the main theory which I used to support the study is the diffusion of innovation theory. And on this theory, for technology to diffuse, there is need for a conducive environment which allows different stakeholders to tap into emerging technologies. So if the environment is not conducive enough, then such technology may not diffuse, and then we'll continue to have low rates in terms of usage of emerging technologies. And in the literature as well, I picked a few countries using my own discretion to look at the current state of emerging technologies within the Southern Africa. So the first one is South Africa, where we are. And indeed, there is some progress in as far as emerging technologies are concerned. You're going to find that there's also high internet penetration rate, because we cannot talk about technology and leave internet. That's impossible. Then you're also going to know that the government has got a plan to educate 1 million young people in robotics and artificial intelligence by 2030, which is 7 years from now. But however, from my perspective, such a target is good, but we need to look at the feasibility and do we have what it takes to achieve such a target? That's one thing we need to look at. And you're going to discover as well that the South African economy has got challenges in as far as technology is concerned. It suffers from cybercrime. And the research shows that on average per year, it is losing 2.2 billion South African rand due to cybercrime. So also, in as far as that is a cause for concern, but it's an opportunity as well that if the country invests in emerging technology, we can address or reduce the cyber crimes. Then I also took Zimbabwe, where I come from, because I'm patriotic. You find that the economy is not doing very well as far as the technology is concerned. Internet access is a challenge, and you're going to see that, of course, the country is doing its best to try and harness technology within the education sector, the finance, but the country is suffering from challenges like the energy crisis. And you find that the poor financial sector make people not to use some of the banking services and the technology. So people, they would prefer to keep money at home or under the mattresses. So these are some of the things which are affecting Zimbabwe. So I also looked at Angola. Angola has also made some progress. It provides telemedicine, and its communication sector is liberalized, which means that more players are allowed to take part within the telecommunication sector. But however, it's also suffering from challenges, and some of these challenges are poor internet access, as well as the digital divide. You find that not many people have got access to digital services, as well as low industrialization levels. So this research was qualitative in nature, and you remember that the main aspect or the main aim was to find the challenges which are faced by countries within the Southern Africa. So the first one is the issue of limited ICT experts. For example, if you look at Zimbabwe, the country is going through economic turmoil and quagmires. So as a result, there's brain drain. And if you look, for example, currently, a teacher earns less than 10,000 Rand equivalency. So if an ICT expert is also learning less, you can't expect them to stay. So people, they are going to look for greener pastures and they leave. So this is also affecting not only Zimbabwe, but also a number of countries within Southern Africa. Then the second aspect is of digital illiteracy, where you find that people, they lack the knowledge of how to do it. This reminds me of our first year at university. And the university made it a mandatory that everyone should do a course in ICT. And you find that on the very first day, just to switch on the computer, there were serious prayers made, because people were never exposed to it. Even to save a document, people would raise hands, the mouse has disappeared, I don't know where it is. It's because of illiteracy. And that's bad. Now, you're going to find that also in Africa, the prices of internet, they are very high, as well as the price of technological consumables. And that limits the opportunities of Southern African economies to tap into emerging technology. And another finding which I discovered from the research is of illicit financial flows. Research shows that Sub-Saharan Africa from 1980 has lost more than 1.3 trillion US dollars, which was meant to develop the technological sector, which means there are certain people who benefited at the expense of the majority. Then you're also going to find that there's the issue of poor policies. For example, Zimbabwe, some time back, introduced the computer programs, and it went on to buy computers. But surprisingly, they will distribute the computers at schools where there's no electricity. How is that going to work? Are they going to use firewood or what? We don't know. It boggles the mind. Then on the research as well, wanted to know the opportunities which can be tapped into. And as well, why is it important for Southern Africa to tap into emerging technologies? You're going to find that bulk of the African economies, they subscribe to SDG goals. And technology is at the center of the attainment of sustainable development goals. For example, poverty, energy, economic growth, industrialization. The ICT creates opportunities. So if people are employed, they get incomes, then some of them will be relieved from the vicious jaws of poverty. So the opportunities which are there, artificial intelligence can be used in the pharmaceuticals. This is very important. We all experienced COVID, and you find that every country was busy importing some of the pharmaceuticals, but there's an opportunity for us to use artificial intelligence, and the COVID has been a rude awakening for us, that Africa, we can also produce our own pharmaceuticals to use, and we don't import more, right? Then secondly, 3D printing, which is also an emerging technology, can be used in the industrialization sector or in the manufacturing. And thirdly, we can use energy storage solutions. And you find that right now we are talking of electric vehicles. And for us to produce that, we need some of the minerals like manganese, nickel, which is all abundant in Africa. But are we using that? Because this is an opportunity for us. And as a matter of fact, EU has banned non-electric vehicles from 2030, 7 years down the line. As Africa, what are we embracing, or we are still exporting the raw minerals, while China is busy developing the electric vehicle batteries? So we have got opportunities, but are we tapping into it? I'm not sure. Then we have got water treatment technologies. This is an emerging technology, and we can use this to deal with issues of cholera. Bulk of African countries, they struggle with this issue of water and sanitation. And we have the technology which we can use to deal with such a problem. Then hydrogen technologies, it's also an emerging technology. We can use it to deal with the energy crisis. We are all suffering from blackouts, and those some have got solars, but here and there you try to navigate the room using your hands. You see this pillar. If you touch a portrait, you know, maybe I'm now in the dining room. We can't deal with that. We have got an opportunity to address that. Now, you're going to find that we have got the agro-processing technologies, which can be used as well in Southern Africa agricultural sector, where we use them to add value and also to create job opportunities. Now, coming to the policy recommendations, what can be done to solve this? The first thing is of public-private partnerships. The private sector need to work hand in hand with the state and the government so that we deal with the issues which are affecting the ICT sector. Then we also need robust ICT policies. By robust, I don't mean policies which are free of grammatical errors or nice targets which can make people to be happy and clap hands. Afterwards, they go for group photos. No. Robust ICT policies should have specific measurable, attainable targets, which should be followed and be implemented. And these policies should be reviewed periodically because the world we are living in is very dynamic. Then we also need curriculum reforms. Why? If what we are teaching in the educational sector cannot change the students and the community they live in, then we're teaching them useless things. Myself, I'm a Zimbabwean. I've been told that I've got a totem, which is gumbo. They refer to, which is part of the car, that's the lower part. It's a totem, and I was taught, and there are also certain things you can recite your totem, but I wasn't taught more things about technology when I was young. So there's nothing wrong to know about such things, but if we don't reform the curriculum and we also teach issues to do with technology, and we center on things like drawing an elephant, there's nothing wrong. Maybe you're going to be an artist, but if we don't teach the kids that, look, you can buy grocery online from Pick and Pay, and you don't join the long queue. We're not doing justice to the generation now. The generation to come, we are actually wasting them. So there's need for us to reform the curriculum at lower level to deal with the issues of ICT. It's not a national agenda, but we must address it from grassroots level. So some of the curriculums we have, they need to be revamped, and we need to change some of the things which I call useless. You can quote me Freeman 2023. Then on the next recommendation, we need to mobilize financial resources. It's not enough to have policies alone. It's good, but it's not a necessary and sufficient condition. We must have proper funding that is channeled towards the development of the ICT sector, right? Then the other thing which is very important is to have research and development. We cannot have people we hire to say, just design a policy for us. Then when we are done, we take it, they go on the media, we've got policies, we're going to invest in research and development, but what are we doing in real life? Also, on research and development, it is essential for other organs in Africa, the African Union, the SADC, and other trading blocs as well, to invest in research and development so that Africa, we don't lag behind in as far as technology is concerned. Thank you.
I'm happy to see gentlemen competing, to see, you know, like when people are running 100 meters, they all want to complete within a short space of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Mateko. We've heard of a very free citation, Freeman 2023, and the word there was useless. So thank you so much. I think most of us here are academics, and I think we can begin when we do our citations. Don't forget that. I think he also needs some citation down the sleeve in terms of his portfolio. Thank you so much, Freeman. The last presenter of the day, it's Rex Asiama. You are going to be talking to us about the drivers of high-tech manufacturing in African countries. I just like how these sessions or these topics were grouped. So I believe the questions will sort of be very similar and complex. If you are ready, we are also ready to listen to you, sir. There we go. It's ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. So I also want to take the time to acknowledge my co-author and brother, Elvis. He's online. I know he can't see this. So if there are any specific questions that I can't answer, perhaps he can bail me out. But let's see how it goes. All right. So I worked through this outline in this presentation, and I hope that you enjoy the contents of it and find it as interesting as we do. All right. So anybody familiar with the literature arguing in favor of manufacturing as an engine of growth and the arguments in favor of industrialization will appreciate the time we spent here trying to pull out the main arguments over time about the importance of manufacturing and industrialization to development. The arguments have evolved over time, starting by saying that one, manufacturing is an engine of growth. Also, export composition, specifically manufacturing exports, are important for industrial development. But after moving beyond that, a further arguments, which now begin to talk about the technology content of manufacturing or exports. And we situate our work in this space or in these arguments by saying that, these studies that have begun talking about the importance of technology in manufacturing are yet to, or the literature is yet to sort of come to a conclusion on what are the determinants of technology-intensive manufacturing. So we situate the work in this space, and we pick interesting methodology by Haraguchi and others to achieve these two objectives, which is to determine the countries that have relative probability of success at medium and high-tech manufacturing. And in order to do that, we're extending the methodology to analyze growth episodes of medium and high-tech manufacturing. And then based on that, we identify the drivers of such relative probability of success. So the way we do it is to gather data on African countries based on availability from different sources and compile that into a panel. And before we do the econometric stuff, the methodology involved here to determine a country's relative probability of success is spelled out in Haraguchi's paper. In our case, the main measure of medium and high-tech manufacturing here is the MHVA-SH, which is the medium and high technology value-added share of total manufacturing value-added. Now, the methodology allows us to group countries into two main categories, those that are likely to succeed and those that are not, based on their episodes of tech-intensive manufacturing. Right. Now, having done that, we now go and adopt a model from Haraguchi also in a different paper, where he uses that model to try to identify the factors that can propel a country's industrialization across continents. But we're picking that now and now using MHT manufacturing as the dependent variable. In selecting the determinants, we scan across several studies to select, some economic, social, institutional, resource, and political factors. And you rightly expect some of them to play out consistent with what we'd expect. I mean, Dr. Freeman spoke a lot about human capital training and, development. All of those things seem to play out in the results that we have. And this is just another slide explaining some of the other political and resource factors that we included. But more so, we thought to account for initial conditions in manufacturing because not all the countries began on the same level of MVA share of GDP. And that sort of would be a way to account for the relative differences in industrial capacity across countries. So the empirical model I spoke about from Haraguchi is what I presented here, and it sort of, explains what particularly the model was used for. Our interest, however, is extending this model by using MHT manufacturing as a dependent variable. All right. So to summarize, I mean, the first big thing that comes out of the paper is that we do realize that there are some countries in Africa that have a relative probability of success of industrialization. If we look at, using the growth of manufacturing value added as a measure, you have, a few countries. But when we now look at the MHT manufacturing share, it reduces considerably to about 5 countries. On the determinants, we do find most of the factors that we expect, economic factors, social factors, etc. I'll talk about some of those. But what comes out of much of the economic factors is some, like GDP, have a non-linear relationship. And that tells us a bit about, convergence in manufacturing that Roderick spoke about in 2013, which is to say that, on a trajectory of growth, you would expect that those that are smaller and those that have more agency to grow are rising or growing faster than those that have already achieved it to a certain extent. The other part is human capital, which tells us that you actually need more education and skills training to improve the relative probability of success. It's not just a straight line sort of relationship. Right? Then there are other factors, like trade, FDI, and these are more finance related, but they will mainly solve the problems of capital flight and some of these things that Dr. Freeman mentioned earlier. Political and institutional factors also come to play. Domestic credit given to the private sector also comes to play with others like the resource factors, like mineral rents in GDP. And we find some similarity with earlier studies. All right. So just to wrap up, we are saying that the technological progress is fundamental to industrial development. But we don't find that many Southern African countries with a relative probability of success in medium and high-tech industrialization, particularly for South Africa, because the Africa Industrialization Index, which was recently published by the AFDB, also says that Southern Africa, is at the top, seems to be relatively most industrialized, but the growth is slowing down. And this is using data between 2010 and 2021. However, these factors must be known so that if countries choose to adapt using whichever type of policy, industrial policy specifically, then you know that you can actually improve your chances of succeeding at MHT industrialization. Yeah, on this note, I bid you thank you.
I think these three gentlemen deserve a better sound of applause. And unless if somebody's jealous that they finished within a specified time. And I'm sorry if I scared you, but I was very serious. Yeah, it reminds me of my friend when I grew up, because I was very skinny and I used to talk a lot. So I used to be in trouble. So most of my friends were quite bigger because at least they could stand up and protect me. So thank you once more for the presentation. I think unless if you shared notes, but for me, they were like sort of flowing, and I think this will give us an easy way to start engaging. I'm looking at the time, it's 12:15. We can push it to 12:27 for questions and answer. So I'm not going to give my reflections now, because as a moderator, I should make you talk. Let's take the online questions first, and then he can, it's quite a lot. Okay, I'm going to read them as they are. I think this one is to Rendani. What policy proposal could be considered by government to increase private sector R&D? South Africa has R&D tax incentive. Yes, has your research looked at the uptake of this incentive by the private sector? Let's see another one. I think it's a comment. The first one was from Tokozisi Zondi. He said, it would be important to look at the application of ICT technologies in enabling transition to smart grid in Southern Africa. Oh, sorry, no, I just get, I think the others were just comments. Okay, that's okay. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Michael Khan will be number 9. Thank you. We can start with 1. Please keep the order because I can't remember anymore.
Sure. Well, if there are 9 questions, I think we're at risk we'll take longer than the presenters. So I will do my best to set the right precedent, to the point.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for some interesting provocations. Rendani, you made me nervous at the end when you start to talk about what should be. Yes, it's low, but I think we need some more comparison in terms of international benchmarks about what is too low, what is too high. I think it would help strengthen your case in terms of whether it may be applied researchers, maybe it's fine to leave the R&D. You need to make a stronger case in terms of why we should believe that applied research should be at a certain level or not. Maybe international benchmarks. So that's my question to you, if you've got any insight. Freeman, I would also like to see some framework in terms of how you select what's emerging, which emerging technologies have the most potential or promise. So, you know, a lot of interesting ideas, but it was a bit difficult for us to ground in terms of, you know, what theoretical framework or what conceptualization can you use to ground the choice of what's most important or what's least important. Yeah, that would certainly help us. And then Rex, my question to you would be, so I think it's one thing to run an econometric model which predicts how chances of success. I think is another thing to say, well, what's good enough in terms of those chances. You know, at the end you're saying, well, there are only a few countries which have a good enough chance. How do you define that chance? Is there a particular threshold that you think is good enough or not good enough? And then further to that, what worries me is that you might be looking at a number of correlates which predict success, but those things could be quite far removed from the actual drivers underneath. So if you've got FDI as an indicator, it might be a strong correlation, but actually why FDI is high in the first place could be driven by other factors that are underneath those mechanisms. And so I think you need to be careful in terms of this issue of, yes, we've got factors that predict success, but they're not necessarily the mechanisms. And those mechanisms come down to the policy choices for countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we stick to 2 questions per person, please? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
The other questions will be for networking after this. So I'm giving the chance. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you, the presenters. I will not make long speeches, and also I've got only one question.
Just introduce yourself.
Temwani Ndiako from Ministry of Mining in Malawi. My question is going to Rendani. You have talked of the state allocating resources to the business sector. I would like to know ways, if your research have you have got ways in which the state can allocate resources to the business sector for innovation and R&D. Thank you.
Thank you. Who's number 3? I was instructed to ask you to stand up when you ask questions so that they can take that nice picture of you. Okay, who's the 3rd one? Can we get a mic to the 3rd question? I said I can't remember, so if I called you 3, it means your name is 3 until you ask. You should be 3. Thank you. Just introduce yourself and hit to the question.
So I'm Mohammed Patel from TIPS, and I'm going to try and follow the precedent that Justin set down, because he was actually my tutor at universities. I have to respect him now, right? Okay. So
you don't give a speech.
Yeah, I won't. So my question is, both my questions are for Rendani. So the first question very quickly is, you mentioned that, you know, individual levels. So when we see high levels of applied research in the private sector, that's not a bad thing. But if we see it persisting over time, my sense was that you were saying that it's a bad thing. So I want to know why, because my expectation would be that private sectors value a certain level of efficiency when it comes to expenditure. So it makes sense that they would be spending on things that are problems for them rather than experimental stuff. And the second question was related to, so is there anything that you can say with respect to firm size and how the extent to which private firms undertake the different types of research, and the urgency to transition due to particularly strong constraints like climate change, for example. So you could be a very large firm, but if you face an immediate threat, this could drive your research into, let's say, experimental versus applied. So is there any particular story around that? That's it. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. I'm David from University of Cape Town. Questions for Rendani and Rex. Rendani, did you at all try to look at the patterns across different kinds of firms in terms of how R&D has been moving across time? Because I think that will be very good to see, and then it will make it easy to know where to target policies in the future. So if large firms are doing what they need to do anyway, then you don't need to worry about them as much. That's just an example. And then for Rex, I think it would be nice to see just a graphic of, you know, where all of these countries stand before you jump into your, because it's very hard to picture where they're at and you have the results. But one more thing is, I know you control for initial GDP, but I think what you might actually want to control for is maybe initial state of technology, because that has a much stronger impact on whether or not subsequent levels of innovation are successful or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's pause here because I see Rendani and everyone can't wait to, you're number 5, ne? 4. Okay. Let's take one more, then we get to answers.
Okay, so thank you very much. I have the questions I have is for 3 of you, but just one question though. Rendani, I was wondering if you've considered, let me face the camera. I was wondering if you've considered the role of business support organization collectively going into research to support the industry. And as well, the role of business support organization, because what I got from it is individual businesses going into R&D, but they have all, most of them have an associations. Is they one of their assignments? And you also talked about one troubling issue about patent usage and registration, and it's mostly foreign, non-resident. I was wondering if you consider, are they multinationals? Are they, which sector? Are they manufacturer or service sector? And the ownership, is it already registered somewhere and they came into South Africa to then renew, or just to have their stuff, not to prevent any other one getting into it, the usage? So for Freeman, have you considered what is different between IoT and emerging technology? And for us as Africans that wants to industrialize and which you are recommending that technology can as well accelerate this, what would you recommend government to practically push out in the short term to kickstart that industrialization using technology? What they said I should be fast, time. Okay, so
just repeat the sentence that ends with a question mark.
Okay. What would you recommend government in terms of policy should initiate to kickstart industrialization in the short term?
Thank you.
For Rex, troubling.
I said 2 questions.
Okay, so just last one for Rex. When you point out these countries that don't start a chance for industrialization, is it lack of human capital or resources? What are the challenges? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who wants to start, Rendani?
Yeah, they'll be shared, but I think, yeah, we can take some of the conversation over digital tea. All right. I think so. I'll be brief as well. In terms of the patents, it's not applications, it's granted. So it's the actual patent that was granted at the end. So I'm in the private sector. I currently run the research and innovation there. The R&D tax incentive sounds very nice, how it's written, 150%, this and that. But in actuality, it's 14 cents per R1 spent. In fact, South Africa has, so the R&D tax incentive as a concept has got a number of instruments in it. South Africa has chosen one of it, and it's actually the least attractive according to some of the studies. So I think the R&D tax incentive the uptake has not been very good. I know it's been renewed, but the uptake has not been as good as we thought. And I think part of the issues is that it's actually not as attractive as it sounds when you read that section D, 11D and all of that the first time. The reality is that it's not as good. So I think there's aspects there. Then so on the applied research. One of the slides I showed what is considered optimal, where you have about 10% on basic. You've got about 25 on applied, and then eventually your experimental, it's supposed to be 50%. So we are a mismatch of, so I've based that on that. And that optimal, the data is based on China and South Korea. That's what is considered to be an optimal. It's not to say don't do applied, but it's to say on the long term, in terms of driving innovation, you must gear up towards more on the experimental side. And I think the question around the firm size, I've not looked at firm size at the moment. I think I'm still trying to dig into the CESTI data to see what I can find and cannot find. So I think over time I will explore the different aspects. And thanks for those builds. I think they help to expand the research. In terms of what government can do, the Malawi aspect, interestingly, I was there in February, and I've used part of your country for my lecturing work at Wits Business School on energy innovation. So in terms of what government can do, I think this aspect of R&D contracting, based on what the objectives of the country is, I think it's one way of getting the private sector to work on the R&D that the government wants as a start and build that interaction. I think what we see in South Africa, this fragmented nature almost needs to be forced, and we need to figure out how to force it. So over time, we can learn to work together. At the moment, we are not working together, and one has to figure out how to force that. And I think from a DTIC perspective, when countries come like the BMWs and them, instead of just saying they must have a manufacturing side, let's include as part of that package some local R&D, and let's be specific and also follow up on that. I think the same on the energy space and local content and then all of that. So I think I can spend there and stop there. The business associations, I don't think they are driving any of the R&D work. I think business associations are just helping the private sector engage government as part of social partners. I'm not aware of any business association that's trying to drive R&D. Even BUSA is not a concern with R&D conversation. They almost act like a protection shield for the business sector, in my view.
All right, thank you. For the first question, which was raised by Justin, if I'm right, on the choice of these emerging technologies which are used in this research, you are going to find that they can be categorized from the view of burgeoning, those that are still growing and developing. Then some of them, you can view them from the perspective that they are used for warning systems. For example, you nowadays find that you can use technology for early warning systems for hazards. So that's the way in which we can categorize, but also I'll engage with you further after this to get more insights for the purpose of enhancing my knowledge on what you would suggest to solve this issue which you have raised. Thank you. Then on the second questions which were raised by Sam, if I'm right, you first asked about the difference between IoT and emerging technology. In my presentation, I'm sure the first slide I gave a definition of emerging technologies. So to answer you, the Internet of Things, we are looking at the network of physical objectives which are connected through the internet. And if you take the definition I'm giving you and the one which I presented, I hope you grasped it. It will give you the difference. Thank you. Secondly, you questioned how the government should kickstart industrialization in the short term as far as technology is concerned. So the governments in Africa have already kickstarted that, but the pace is low due to the challenges which I mentioned. So there is progress, but the progress is very low. So what can be done to improve are the things which I gave as policy recommendations. This should convince you and satisfy you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate Justin's comments on that. Yeah, so I mean, I think the difficulty with these econometrics exercises is almost always finding the right measure to use in the model, even if the measure you're using accurately captures what you're trying to do. That raises the issue of endogeneity more often than not. And so we try to control for some of these things in the regression model. I mean, using, not to be so technical, but I think you know what I mean, where you're controlling for endogeneity, and also particularly the measure of the dependent variable in this case. Perhaps if it was absolute values, then it would be more controversial, but we try and stay away from that and then just stick to the probit issue. But nonetheless, I appreciate that concern. It's just to say that we control for that. David, about the graphs, which is actually a good idea, and I can say we will look into that. You know, I wanted to keep the presentation very, you know, simple and straightforward because of you know, yeah, as we are aware. Yeah, and then on the other issue of the initial, I think it's a good suggestion. But look, to be honest with you, finding a real measure of initial state of industrial capacity is really hard, right? And we struggled with this thing for several weeks, right, until we came to the measure that we have. In any case, if we're looking at the initial state of technology, the question is, what is the best measure to use? Is it a relative measure or is it an absolute measure, right? In some of these questions we try to answer anyway, but yeah, so thank you for that. The last question, someone asked the last question about what I think is the most strong factor. Is it lack of human capital? Look, I think we all know what the challenges of Africa as far as, you know, the difficulties in industrializing, even with the little that we've done, the challenges that we have. I will say that the human capital is an issue. You know, Dr. Freeman spoke about the curriculum and stuff like that. Much of it needs review, you know, and to propel, you know, us into a direction where you get a lot of benefits for going to school, because as it is now, it looks like people don't really see the benefit of staying in school for an extra 4 years and you come out and you can't find a job. That is a practical issue that the policymakers can look at. But from our point of view, using secondary data to do this type of exercise, we're just concerned with the rights measure. Perhaps we'll leave the rest of the discussion for the policymakers, you know, because even with something like a lack of resources, you know, it's also about beneficiation, who's getting the most out of what, and where the value is added in the first place, you know, and that's a long debate that we can have. I don't think we can cover that now. Thank you.
Can we go to, I'm told we have very few minutes, so if you could do the honor.
I'll try to be
and only ask 2 questions.
Okay, no, it's just one. Okay, with some commentary. Okay, so I agree with Rendani, so it's to you, that we need better interactions between state and private sector in order to engage on technology and R&D. We definitely need more R&D. Where I'm not convinced is why you're saying the applied should become lower and in favor of the fundamental research. Because as a developing country, we need more diffusion of technology, we need technology upgrading, but why can't we do that through adopting other countries' technologies, innovating, using those technologies, and then upgrading, and over time then move? So your comparator country of China and South Korea, I'm interested in when you look at South Korea and at what time frame, because if you're looking 40 years ago, surely we can't be compared to a developed country and their allocation of resources to those things. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. My question is also to Rendani. I'm so sorry for the flurry of questions, man. But just a quick one is, so how much of the decline in business R&D can be explained by the current economic conditions in our country? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, there's one. Okay. Okay.
Hi.
Just that sentence that ends with a question mark.
Yes.
Thank you.
What measure did you use for investment? Why did you use GDP and GDP per capita in the model? And then the positive, negative outcome. I saw the explanation on board, but I didn't get to read it. Maybe you can just explain it.
Okay. No.
That's for, I think, yeah.
That's what, just the last. Do you still want to ask your question or you want to reserve it for lunch? Okay, just sure. That question, please.
Thanks, Rendani. It's about the experimental research. It's the drivers towards the outcome, because sometimes you find that experimental research can be quite costly as opposed to applied research. So it'd be quite interesting to know what are the determining factors that would see, that change between the two.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna do this. I will let them still on the hook of not answering these questions, because I would want us to move into the closing session. We still have lunch, and I would like the engagements to continue over lunch and so forth. So, and the questions that were asked, I don't think those are questions that I don't think you have answers for, and I think the colleagues were asking just to get more clarity. So I will say don't respond now, but definitely you need to walk to them over lunch. If you need to sit next to them over lunch, I think it will be appreciated for you just to attend to the questions. Because I need SMEs and the industry to get that incentive, because we provide funding and for them to go and engage further with other partners. So I think I will do that. But then the last thing is that throughout, I missed one point that no one said. No one mentioned the issue of technology and science. Not because I'm from science and innovation, but I believe science should be a driver of this. And my part in short is that as Africans and beyond, we should know that science knows no border and it knows no flag. So let's allow the industrialists and the scientists and everyone to work together. On that basis, ladies and gentlemen, this brings to the end of this robust discussion and discussion and so forth. Thank you so much, TIPS colleagues, for this opportunity. Let's get the engagements going over lunch and beyond. Thank you.